Well, there's been a lot of talk about statues in the news over the last few days, and it's reminded me of when I stood by a statue of my own great-grandfather in the town of Viljandi in Estonia. He was for many years the mayor of that city until he was captured by Soviet forces in the Second World War and tragically died of starvation a few years later in Siberia. But as far as I'm aware, no one anywhere is calling for the removal of his statue. But the same cannot be said for many other statues around our world right now. Many of us would have seen on Sunday how the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol was dragged through the streets of Bristol and unceremoniously dumped in the harbour. You see, Edward Colston was commemorated for being a philanthropist, for giving much of his money to the poor of the city. But actually that money came from being a slave trader, money that was gained from the enslavement, from the misery, from the torture and the death of literally thousands of African Americans. And so on the one hand, it seems absolutely obvious, doesn't it, that you would want to get rid of some icon of oppression like that. Who would want to keep a statue of a man like him in their city? We don't get surprised that the Russians wanted to remove statues of Stalin. We don't get surprised that the Germans removed the symbol of the swastika. And so equally, should we not be surprised that we would want to get rid of such symbols of oppression and injustice from our own history? But I guess my question over the whole issue is this: where do we actually stop when we start doing things like this? This isn't the last statue to be removed, as we've seen over the course of this week. Other statues have already been torn down, either legitimately or illegitimately. And Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, has announced there is going to be a commission looking at whether other statues in London need to be removed, indeed whether certain places need to be renamed because of who they are named after and because of who they commemorate. But of course, that raises some interesting questions about who should stand and who should fall. What about Sir Winston Churchill, a great hero to many, and yet someone who is perceived to have some very strongly racist ideas? Should he be commemorated, or should his statue go? Well, there's a big debate there. But even more interestingly, and especially for Sadiq Khan, is another statue that he actually unveiled just 2 years ago. Millicent Fawcett was one of the suffragettes who fought for women's right to be able to vote just over 100 years ago. And her statue was unveiled in Parliament Square, not far from Churchill's statue. It was the first woman to be commemorated in Parliament Square. A great moment, and rightly so. But it's also worth noting that Millicent Fawcett, for all her incredible work as a suffragette, also held some deeply racist views. She was actually complicit in the concentration camps of South Africa that led to the deaths of about 25,000 Black Africans. She said things that would be considered explicitly and strongly racist. So what about her statue? Should that also be left to stand, or should it also be pulled down? You see, what we see here is that there is a real problem with some of the thinking behind the things that we're seeing in our world right now. We may or may not realize that the ideology behind a lot of what is happening is something called contemporary critical race theory. It's an academic idea, but at the heart of it, amongst other things, is this concept that you can divide the world into two groups of people. You can divide the world into the oppressor and the oppressed. So the whites are obviously the oppressors and blacks are oppressed. Men have often been oppressors and women are the oppressed. And we can see how that's played out in history, and there is a certain degree of truth to that, isn't there? But here's the problem with dividing the world into two groups in that way. Sometimes people can be both, can't they? So Winston Churchill, in his fight against fascism in the Second World War, was seeking to liberate our country from oppression. But in his racist views, we could also say that he was an oppressor. Millicent Fawcett, in her incredible work as a suffragette, was seeking to end oppression for women. And yet in her racist views and her complicity to what was going on, you could also say that she was an oppressor. How do we deal with the fact that it's a bit more complicated than simply putting people in two categories, one or the other? I've recently been reading The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn suffered a great deal at the hands of the Soviet Union. He, in fact, was imprisoned for many years, and his book outlines the incredible suffering and injustice that he experienced during that time and under that system. And he shows the deep irony that the Soviet system that was designed to end oppression and to fight against injustice actually led to even greater oppression and injustice than the oppression that it was seeking to overthrow. You see, by grouping people together in a similar way and describing some as oppressors and others as oppressed, people were guilty not so much for what they individually had done, but for simply being part of a particular class or group. And such groups ultimately had to be eliminated. But it's Solzhenitsyn's response to the evil and injustice that he experienced that I find incredibly insightful. You see, it would be very easy for someone like Solzhenitsyn to simply say, the problem is with those people or that political system. But he doesn't. Listen to what he says. He says, so let the reader who expects this book to be a political expose slam its covers shut right now. If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who's willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Now, don't get me wrong, Solzhenitsyn is not saying that everyone is equally good and bad. He recognizes that some can be more or less, but he goes on to explain it when he says this. During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place. Sometimes it's squeezed one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish. One and the same human being is, at various ages, under various circumstances, a totally different human being. At times, he is as close to being a devil, and at times to sainthood. But his name doesn't change, and to that name we ascribe the whole lot, good and evil. Socrates taught us, know thyself. But it's this conclusion that I find incredibly insightful, particularly challenging, and especially relevant given the events that we've seen over the last few days. He says this, confronted by the pit into which we are about to toss those who have done us harm, we halt, stricken dumb. It is, after all, only because of the way things worked out that they were the executioners and we weren't. You see, what is Solzhenitsyn saying? He is saying it is too simplistic to divide the world into simply the oppressed and the oppressor. He's saying all of us at times can be both oppressed, but we can also be the oppressor. Good and evil exists in all of our hearts. And before we toss people away, just take a moment to think. In the same point in history, in the same circumstances as these people who we are decrying, would we have done the same or worse? See, Solzhenitsyn's words are cause to examine our own hearts, aren't they? And to recognize that none of us are the people that actually ultimately we should be. And actually, Solzhenitsyn's words really echo the words that were spoken 2,000 years before by Jesus Christ himself. Jesus speaking to a bunch of self-righteous religious leaders who were convinced that because of their virtue signaling, they were good and that other people was where the problem was at. To these people, Jesus said this, it is from within, out of people's hearts that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evil come from inside and defile a person. See, Jesus saying actually the problem is not just out there, the problem is also in here. And we need to face up to the problem, the evil, and the oppression in our own hearts as well. And yet the wonderful news is that Jesus didn't simply come to condemn. As one person put it, Jesus didn't come to rub it in, he came to rub it out. Jesus came to set us free from what we find in all of our hearts and to offer us forgiveness. You see, at the heart of the Christian story is how Jesus not only came to live, but ultimately to die. See, the symbol at the heart of Christianity is also a symbol of oppression, but it's a symbol of how God himself, the God who has all power and authority, became oppressed and suffers on a cross. And that is an incredible thing to think about. For when we find ourselves the victims of oppression and injustice, we can look to Jesus and look to the cross and see in Jesus someone who understands, who stands with us in our oppression and our injustice, and he knows what it's like. But also when we face up to the fact that we ourselves can be the oppressors, when we face up to our own guilt and wrong, we also see that Jesus not only suffered with us, but he also suffered for us. He took the ultimate consequences and the ultimate justice for what all of us have done, so that we can be forgiven, so that we can be set free, and so that we can be transformed. Someone who came to discover that incredible forgiveness and transformation that Jesus brings was another slave trader by the name of John Newton. He became a captain of ships that sailed around the world from Liverpool. And it was during one of those journeys that he had a powerful encounter that woke him up to the reality of where he was at before God. He became a committed Christian, and in the course of time, he came to reject the slave trade that he'd been part of. In fact, he became a key abolitionist. One of his sermons, because he became ultimately a vicar after his conversion, had a massive influence upon William Wilberforce, who then led the abolition movement here in the UK. But John Newton himself is most famous for probably one of the best known hymns of all time, the hymn Amazing Grace. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. At the heart of the Christian story stands a message of grace. And it is that message of grace that allows us to face up to the evil that's not just out there, but also face up to the evil that's in here. It's that message of grace that allows us to do that because we can know in Jesus that we will not be condemned, tossed away and rejected, but we can be forgiven. And by his power in us, we can be changed and transformed. And that is fantastically and wonderfully good news.